Today I speak with Dr. Michael Robbins, who heads the Arab Barometer out of Princeton University. The Arab Barometer has been doing a lot of work gauging and better understanding public opinion all across the Arab world. Thank you so much for joining us, Michael.
Thanks so much, Marissa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Last time you and I spoke, just a few weeks after the Hamas attacks on October 7th, you talked to us about newly released data on where the Palestinians were when it comes to their views or their support for the various Palestinian factions, be it Fatah or the Palestinian Authority or Hamas. We also talked a little bit about support for the Abraham Accords in our various conversations, which you also capture in your various surveys. I know that you've also been conducting new surveys across the region. What are some of the new trends that you have captured in the last few months in the post-October 7th, basically, era?
So we have been doing a lot of surveys across the region, as you say, trying to understand the change. And we are seeing huge shifts, particularly in views of international actors. And one of the big shifts we've seen is in support for the United States, or US favorability. We were in the field in Tunisia 3 weeks before the attacks and then 3 weeks after the attacks. And what we saw was just a massive shift in the 3 weeks afterwards. Before the attacks, 40% of Tunisians said they had a positive view of the United States. And by October 27th, our estimates are that it was only 10%. So a 30-point decline in just 20 days. So essentially, as the United States moved to support Israel, Tunisians lost faith in the United States and really turned against it in effect. And as we've surveyed more countries subsequently, we have seen a similar trend. We've seen in places like Jordan and Lebanon, big shifts against the United States in terms of attitudes. So it does seem like one of the major outcomes of this is an unsurprising shift in opinion against the United States. One of the other elements we found that was a bit surprising to us at the time was that views of China didn't necessarily change in Tunisia before and after the attacks. There was essentially no change for China, but what we did find was that there was an increase in support for, if we put US policies, compared them to Chinese policies on certain issues, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, regional security, there was a shift towards China. What we saw as we did more surveys across the region was that even though the image of China didn't improve in Tunisia immediately, over time, this did seem to have an effect that not only was there a greater support for Chinese policies, but that this really did lead to greater support for China's image as well.
And what about Russia? Because that is also another great power. The Middle East has always been one of the main theaters for great power competition. And of course, Russia is engaged in a war in Ukraine, and there have been various views of what that actually means in the region. So I was wondering how Russia is viewed, given that it is an occupier in Ukraine.
So this is one of the particularly interesting findings. Obviously, Russia is another adversary of the United States. So even as China's essentially sat on the sidelines throughout this conflict, voted in the UN, but not really done anything directly, we have seen an increase there, but we haven't seen the same increase for Russia. We've seen that Russia's essentially maintained more or less the same level of support as it had 2 years before. Before the conflict, most of those surveys were done before its invasion of Ukraine. There hasn't necessarily been a change in Russia. That said, it is more popular now than the United States overall. We do see that the United States has fallen across most of the region. Russia's maintained, so Russia does have that advantage. But one of the really surprising things we've seen is that support for Russia's invasion of Ukraine is very, very low. In most countries, Russia's image is actually, say, 2 to 4 times as high as its support for its invasion of Ukraine. So it does seem that the saliency of the Ukraine issue is actually relatively low. It isn't something that's really shifting opinions within the Middle East and North Africa, perhaps because it is really reflected through the Gaza lens as opposed to the Ukraine lens. And so even though people are noticing the inflation, other challenges to their ability to afford food, so much of it did come from Russia and Ukraine prior to the attacks. It isn't necessarily translating into changes in views of Russia. And so Russia's essentially maintained more or less the same as it was 2 years ago.
And if we just zoom in for a minute into attitudes or views of the United States, are the questions focused on just general support of the United States or favorability, or is it more focused on US policy in the region?
So the biggest change we see is on just US favorability. Do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of the United States? What's interesting is we dig down on that, we do see differences in different areas. So if we ask, is US foreign assistance still effective in the region? We don't see a change. Actually, in most countries, there's a slight increase. So it does seem that it's not necessarily punishing the United States across the board. Any question we ask about the United States is getting rejected and people don't want it. It really is about this policy issue. And part of what that is, I think we're seeing, so we ask people who is the United States, or are different countries defending Palestinian or Israeli rights? Very, very few see the United States as defending Palestinian rights, whereas the vast majority and most countries do see it as siding with Israel in that sense. And so it is, I think, a political disagreement about how the United States is carrying out its policy towards Gaza, as opposed to a broader issue. That said, one of the surprising findings we do find is in Morocco, we don't necessarily see a decline. We actually see a slight increase in support for the United States during this period. And what's notable about that is really the policy towards Western Sahara. The United States recognized Western Sahara as part of the Abraham Accords. And then President Biden really emphasized this in the second half of 2023 to emphasize that the United States was going to continue this policy. And so in a sense, even though other European actors who fell in most of the countries, their image, the United States maintained in Morocco, while, say, the UK, France fell in their image. And so it does seem that the policy does matter, that what happened in Morocco with Western Sahara led to a stabilization of US support overall, but elsewhere it fell pretty dramatically. So again, there's a very nuanced view of the United States across the region, depending on exactly how it's being asked.
And with regards to Lebanon, because you mentioned attitudes shifting also in Lebanon and Jordan, did you look at differences between the different sects in Lebanon, or like the religious sects in Lebanon, with regards to attitudes towards the United States?
We did. It shifts in the ways that you would expect, that there are differences by sect, Christians being a bit more supportive overall of the United States, for example, Druze as well. But there was a decline really amongst all groups. It was a across the board decline in the case of Lebanon.
And I guess one of the other trends that other surveys have captured, primarily by Khalil Shaqaqi in the Palestinian territories, was that even in Gaza, there is a slight shift towards going back to negotiations, supporting that avenue. And of course, for many Palestinians in Gaza who have been forcefully displaced once, sometimes twice or three times, who've lost relatives, they probably do not see the military option as the way forward for them for Palestinian self-determination. So that was an interesting shift. We've seen and heard the Biden administration talk about the importance of the two-state solution, and that is, of course, the point of entry for all of the Arab governments and Arab leaders when they're asked about the day after, that there has to be some sort of political horizon with the two-state solution as the end goal. Do you see any shift towards supporting the peace process after this war? I mean, there's a lot of anger, and clearly your data is showcasing that many people see the United States as complicit, perhaps, and so the attitudes are shifting. But are there also, is there a trend towards perhaps looking at the political process as a way moving forward?
I think this is one of the really interesting and perhaps hopeful findings, is that there was a huge amount of anger, and certainly in Khalil's polls, we've seen the majority of Gazans saying that they've lost a family member in this conflict. And indeed, we did see this increase in support at the same time. What we found in Tunisia was that essentially there was a move towards what was a military option in the days after October 7th. There was, I think, a significant anger and a feeling of this. But I think as time has progressed, what we've seen in most countries is actually a rise in support for the two-state, and actually substantial, between, say, in most countries, about 10 points, moving in this direction of a two-state solution. And so it does seem that as the tragedies unfolded in Gaza, as people have reflected on this, that the realistic option that would bring peace to the region, bring dignity to the Palestinians, bring safety and security to the region, it really would be the two-state. And so I do think that even though there's a significant amount of anger, real frustration across the region, there is a recognition that this would be the only way forward to bring peace. And we do see that reflected in the survey data that we've collected since October 7th.
Well, and that is, of course, the silver lining of a very tragic situation in the Palestinian territories, but especially in Gaza. Michael Robbins, thank you so much for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the discussion when you have more data to share with us to better understand public opinion across the Arab world. Thank you.
Exactly. Thank you.